Welcome to Peace, Love, and Pollinators, the podcast that's anything but your typical gardening show. We're here to transform how you see your backyard, balcony, or local park by uncovering the powerful connections between you, your plants, and the planet. From pollinator-friendly gardening hacks to creating green spaces that fight climate change, we explore more than just what to plant. We dig into why it matters. You are listening to Peace, Love, and Pollinators. All right, and welcome to Peace, Love, and Pollinators. Today we have a very good friend of mine, and we will be discussing compost and all things compost, the importance of it, how to make it, and anything else that you may want to know. Monique Bosch is with us. Monique teaches microscopy, soil health, and composting to farming and organizations. Monique teaches microscopy, soil health, and composting to farmers and organizations at NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association, Brookwood Botanic Garden, the Berkshire Botanical Gardens, and in the last 20 years, she has worked with volunteers and students to build over 40 edible school and community gardens and farms. Monique teaches microscopy, soil health, and composting to farmers and organizations at NOFA, Northeast Organic Farming Association, Brookwood Botanical Garden, Berkshire Botanical Garden, and in the last 20 years, she has worked with volunteers and students to build over 40 edible school and community gardens and farms. Monique studied the soil food web under Dr. Elaine Ingham, and she teaches soil health, microscopy, and grow your own food courses throughout the Northeast. Welcome, Monique.
Thanks,
So
Trevor.
good to see you.
Likewise. And thank you for the wonderful work you're doing in this space and making really big difference for all of us. So thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. All right, so let's just dive right in, because there is a lot of talk about compost amongst gardeners. And if you jump on YouTube, it is just full of how to compost videos. And you can watch 9 videos and learn 9 different ways. But really, let's just start with the basics. And what is compost and why is it important?
Well, when I think of compost, I think about it being a big mixture of ingredients. And it's used as, I know fertilizer is a bad word, but it is a plant fertilizer, and it's used to improve the soil's physical, chemical, and biological properties, all 3. So it's commonly prepared by decomposing plant and food waste, recycling organic materials, sometimes using manure. So there's many inputs you can use to create compost, and we'll talk about those.
Yeah, absolutely, because this is, we could do multiple podcasts, certainly on this. But a question that I like to ask everybody, and something that I just think absolutely, it always fascinates me, is, what was it that connected to you to nature and made you want to work with nature or within this space as your career?
I bet, like most of the listeners, I had already, from the moment I can remember, an affinity for nature. That's when I felt at home. So hiking the Rocky Mountains, when I was in the mountains by myself, I was never alone. I was with nature. And that carried on. And then I became a landscape designer because I wanted to work with nature. And then I felt people were not really realizing what it was all about, which was, to me, the soil. So when I started growing food, I noticed how healthy it was and worked with nature. And then I really wanted to see a microscope. I wanted to see what was going on at that microbial level. So I took Dr. Elaine Ingham's soil food web course. She said, you can certainly learn microscopy, but first you have to take a course in soil biology, composting, compost tea, and then we'll give you the microscope. So I begrudgingly did that, and thank heaven, it changed my life.
Yeah, absolutely. You do have to learn to crawl first. So she is very wise in delivering her methods and delivering her knowledge. Definitely check out that course. Anybody who's listening is certainly worth the while. But see, you talked about how you just became so interested in soil. And me, in starting my career, like soil was just something like, it didn't necessarily in the beginning come naturally. And I think that's because like soil isn't glamorous. Soil is like, to most people, it's just the place where you put your plants, and then you get the plants. Like the plants are the sexy part. Soil certainly isn't glamorous at all. So what was it that drew you to studying soil? Was it in growing vegetables and realizing that if you improve the soil, your vegetables grow better? Or was it the first time you really looked through a microscope and really saw everything that's going on in the soil? Where was the draw?
And maybe this is different for people, but when I was planting things and putting in seeds or whatever, I was always fascinated by the soil. I said, are you really going to be able to handle the life of this seed and bring it to its full potential? And I would hold it and I would feel it and I would smell it. similar to what we teach when we're teaching physical properties of soil. What is the texture like? What is the structure of the soil? What is the aggregate structure like? All of those things. I just didn't understand why one soil was so different from another. And then I started seeing algae blooms. This is my dog, Daisy. I started seeing these algae blooms and seeing polluted soil and realizing it was polluted because fertilizer. Zach Bush says one application of chemical fertilizer will kill half the life in your soil. And it really, this message has to go out. We need to know this. And the more people I can introduce to living soil and have us all start thinking about that, not only will our plants be healthier, our groundwater will be healthier, our food will be healthy.
I think you're dead on. And the way I like to look at it is, you know, fertilizer, we both kind of agree on that term. So I look at soil amendments and building a healthy soil. And when I teach people like in classes and stuff about fertilizer, I'm like, this is like steroids. So fertilizer is going to grow your plant and you're going to have a big giant plant. But just like steroids, you're going to have this big giant plant without the system that can actually support all of that size. There is also an evolutionary relationship between the plants and everything that lives in the soil. And by using chemical fertilizers, you disrupt that relationship, which ends up harming the planet and the plant in the long run. So I'm definitely with you on that.
I was always in nature, working, hanging out. And at that time, when we were growing up, we would leave the house in the morning and make sure we were home by night. That was the only criteria. And so we lived on these bluffs in Scarborough and we would climb up and down the bluffs and just get into all sorts of mischief. And nobody knew where we were. And it was just my home, living in nature, being part of nature. And I don't think I ever gave that up. I don't think I ever stopped feeling that connection. And I think if you do, you want to make sure you're nurturing nature. You feel responsible for it. Any soil that you're taking care of, you want to make sure you do the best to keep all of those organisms, those microorganisms in the soil healthy and functioning, and that symbiotic relationship of the plant taking in the sun, converting that to exudates, giving those through the roots to the microbes. And in exchange, the microbes give whatever nutrients are available back to the plant. That symbiotic relationship, I think, is the key to soil health.
No, absolutely. And it does really start at that young age. I think we need to connect our kids with the planet. And then it doesn't matter if you're a doctor, a mechanic, IT, whatever it is you do. But if you're connected to the planet at a young age, at least that relationships kind of stays within your spirit, no matter where you take your life. Now, let me just kind of dive into where things, especially more on, say, like the home gardener, master gardener level, where things, I believe, start to go wrong. And that is that there are numerous composting methods and there are numerous composting products out there, and all of them claim to be the best. So if you could just talk about, let's start with the methods before we get to the systems. And so if you could walk us through the different types of composting and the pros and cons or the applications of each.
I do teach the three main types of composting: thermophilic, static pile, and worm composting. And I don't even think I mentioned this, but my son and I do have a worm composting business called Wiggle Room. And we've been worm composting. I've been doing it in my dining room for 25 years, but our business has been going for 12 years. And a big part of that is teaching other people how to do worm composting.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we start with the thermophilic, that's the professional way to do things, where you use heat to kill pathogens, to kill weed seeds. It's a quick process because of that heat. The rule for thermophilic composting, and see if you could imagine how much work this is, you have to maintain a temperature of a minimum of 131 degrees for 15 days, and you have to turn your pile 5 times. That is to make proper thermophilic compost. Mm-hmm. So you have a thermometer, and you have to make sure it reaches those temperatures. You have to turn it at the right time. You have to have exactly the right ingredients to be able to heat it up without overheating it. It's a science unto itself.
It is. But on the other end of that, I would have to say the pros would be that you've now eliminated the pathogens and the weed seeds. So you are essentially getting a clean compost.
You really are. And that's why buying properly made thermophilic compost, and using that is key. But if you're doing it at home, the best and simplest way that you can add all your vegetative inputs is a static pile. And what is a static pile? That's really when you layer different products, if you will, on top of each other in a pile. And I'll talk about carbon-nitrogen ratio. You want to make sure it's not too wet, not too dry, and then it will slowly decompose. The things you need: carbon, nitrogen, water, and air. Very simple, although it's somewhat tricky, again, to get that right mixture ratios. The third one I just want to mention is worm composting, where you get the worms to do the work. And the nice thing there is all the microbes buddies will help along with the decomposition. The worms are adding oxygen as they're moving through the pile, and it is their poop that is so rich in plant available nutrients. And so I like having help when I'm doing hard work like decomposing. So having those worms in there, I've found to be just the perfect answer. They're a little picky about what they like. They tell me they really don't like citrus or acidic food or anything like that. And you want to avoid, also with the static pile, adding anything that might have to create pathogens like meat or dairy or anything like that that is not heating up to a point where it's going to kill those pathogens. So I would suggest if you are doing the static pile or the worm composting, that you do vegetative inputs only.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. But it sounds like, and what, I think one of the key takeaways here is no matter what you're doing, composting is an active practice. It's not a set it and forget it, which oftentimes is what I come across when I'm, on a consultation at somebody's house. I'll be looking around, and then there behind the garage is just like some plastic bin, and they're like, oh, that's my compost. And it's just full of like anaerobic wet slop. And I'm just like, compost, it's while it is somewhat set it and forget it, like, you have to, actively feed it and or turn it, or at least hire some wiggly friends to do all of that for you. Now, for vermicomposting, worm composting, is that something that one does, say, indoors only, or is that also an outdoor piece? And what worms are involved when it comes to that, please?
So it's easier to do it indoors because the worm can only handle a temperature from 40 to, say, 80 degrees. So you don't want it in a hot sun, and you also don't want it in the winter. We have come across a solution, actually. If you do have a bin in an unheated garage, for example, you can put something like a heat mat, a seedling mat on top, and put a temperature probe so it turns on only if it goes below 40. So very energy efficient. And the worms are all hanging out underneath the heat, but nothing freezes. So that's a nice solution if you are stuck without any heat available. So say the other part of that question.
Just the other part of the question was just, worm composting, is a thing. So the other part of the question was, what are the worms that one uses? So first I wanted to know is it an indoor and outdoor practice? And these aren't necessarily, you don't go like flipping over rocks and digging in your yard and just grabbing all the worms that you see, out in the yard. So what is the worm that you are going to be choosing to do your vermicomposting? And the other piece was I just kind of wanted to understand, is it an indoor or outdoor activity? You might not want worms in your living room, but certainly, that is something that you could do with your garage and just run your scraps out there. And that sounds like something that's very accessible and very doable to most people.
Yeah, that's a really good solution, to have them in an environment where it's not going to freeze, but it doesn't have to be like I have in your actual dining room. So the worms I use are called Eisenia foetida, or red wigglers. And the reason we chose those worms, they're very efficient decomposers, but they also like to be confined. They don't want to go out like the night crawlers and things that we have out here will tend to try to escape at all times if you put them in a worm bin. These worms actually prefer to be in an enclosed environment. So you can order them online. You can't necessarily dig them up anywhere because they are not native here. And because they're not native, they could freeze. So those are all reasons why you want to keep them in a temperature that doesn't freeze.
Gotcha. So, I guess you were talking about with the static compost, the different layers and the nitrogen ratio, like what's the magic recipe? And this is where you can kind of, if you go through YouTube, this is where you can find a lot of similarities. But from an expert, what is the recipe? Like if I am a home gardener, and I build or purchase myself a compost bin, how do I want those layers to go? What do I want to look out for? And like, what is that magic recipe to make it not foolproof, but to give me a good head start on making sure that I'm doing it right?
Well, for that, you really want to, diversity is key. So the more diverse inputs, the better. And if you think about it as a lasagna, I call it the lasagna method because that's what it is. So say you are starting your bin. The best thing to put at the bottom would be some large logs and branches, and that will allow oxygen at the bottom. And then you start layering. So you might put down a layer of leaves on that to hold in whatever you put above that. And then you could put your food scraps in. So that's a high nitrogen. And then you might want a high carbon, maybe some wood chips. And then you might want to put some soil and introduce some indigenous microbes into your pile and some more food scraps. And then now it's looking a little wet, too much food scraps. Okay, I'm going to add some more leaves. So also keeping an eye on it. You want to have carbon nitrogen ratio of 25-30 to 1. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about carbon nitrogen ratio. Probably the highest carbon source you could put in there are wood chips, which has a carbon nitrogen ratio of 400 to 1. Probably the highest nitrogen level you could put in there is something like spent hops, which is 12 to 1, or alfalfa. Food scraps are generally 20 to 1. Weeds are sometimes 30 or 50 to 1. And cardboard, 100 to 1. So everything, if you look at it that way, that's the lasagna. Now I'm going to put a high carbon layer. Now I'm going to put a high nitrogen layer. And you just keep going like that. And also make sure you have the oxygen. And the most important as well, water. You want to have water in there. So my fancy static pile, it's going to rain. I take the lid off and let it rain and make sure I cover it up again. You can use wood ash, and it's really great for introducing calcium and potassium, but it will also increase the pH of whatever soil you have. So if you know you have acidic soil and you want to make it more alkaline, yes, wood ash is the perfect thing to put in there. Did I mention how important it was to do a soil test to find out what your pH is and what your organic matter is?
And that can be handled pretty much with an extension. And then there are also some, real rough at-home methods. And, just to be clear, while the layering and having the ratios in mind, is pretty exact. If you were to do an at-home test and get a general pH, is that going to be okay? Or do we definitely need, the exact from our extension?
No, just know whether it's, a little bit acidic, then that will work well, having that wood ash in there. If you find you're pretty much just over the neutral, which would be 7, you probably don't want to use wood ash.
Yeah, definitely. And chances are, especially, here in much of New England, not all of New England, but in much of New England, you're definitely going to be on the acidic side usually. So when you're talking wood ash, is that a purchased item? Is that something that we just, can I just go into my fire pit in the backyard or my fireplace and just take the ash from there and add that to my compost?
That's I don't think you can purchase it. Bio is another story, but wood ash, I'm talking for composting, it's just out of your fireplace.
Okay, but it is possible though, especially, yes, you have your soil test, but that is one of the ingredients that you probably don't want to overdo. That's something like you probably don't want to put a whole summer's worth of fire pit ash into your compost because that could make it way too alkaline to be adding to your soil. So that's something that you kind of have to, you dabble in there, along the way. Okay, perfect. But that's great. Are there any other additives like the wood ash that can add, minerals and nutrients to, while we're making our lasagna? Well,
leaves actually are incredibly nutritious. So we don't ever want to get rid of leaves. Don't let anyone take your leaves away, especially if they're under your trees. The trees need that. Feed them. So if you do have an abundance, as we have here, there's always extra leaves, and that makes a really nice layer on your compost. So straw is also a really good one. It doesn't add a lot of nutrients, but it's really good for aeration because all of those tubes are hollow. You might want to stay away from weeds, especially if they have any seeds forming or if they have runners. So any rhizomes, you want to make sure you do not put that in your compost.
All right. So oftentimes what I will see is I will go to somebody's house and they will have basically a squash plant or a pumpkin, growing out of their compost. So what are the most common mistakes that people make? What are the top 3, the top 5 biggest mistakes that people make in the composting practice? And then how do we fix compost when it starts to go wrong? If it gets too wet, if it gets too dry, if we accidentally realize that we have, more brown than green, more carbon than nitrogen, and also just, I guess, a follow-up to that, so it's a 3-part question, is how do we essentially know what our ratio is going to be? We just have this lasagna. We just keep adding stuff. How can you actually tell? Why don't you answer that question first? Because we were just talking about it. How can I actually tell what my carbon to nitrogen ratio is? And then we'll get into the follow-up question of what are the mistakes and how do you fix them?
Know if it's too high carbon because it's just sitting there. Nothing's happening. And so it's very hard to decompose all these carbon sources. If it's too high nitrogen, you're going to end up with a stinky pile, as you were describing. So you want to get something in the middle. And it's, again, a trial and error. Take a look. You have to get in there, maybe with a pitchfork, and loosen it up. See how wet or dry things are. If you find you've got stuff all getting gluey and it starts to smell, add some high carbon. If you find it's just kind of sitting there, it's like dust, add some high nitrogen. And again, it's tweaking it all the time. Then we do the same with the worms. How much food do we give them? Well, we give them the food and then we check. If it's still sitting there 3 or 4 days later, the worms aren't going to eat it. They want food that's already decomposing. Mm-hmm. So rather than attract fruit flies and have it go anaerobic, we'll remove that food and put food that's already broken down. So Gotcha. I might take that food, put it in the freezer, let the cell walls break down, and then put it back to feed the worms.
Gotcha.
So that's another story. But it's always playing with that moisture level, with the density, carbon, nitrogen, and getting more and more familiar with what is high carbon and what is high.
Gotcha. So let's I think maybe we should just break it out like a little bit. So for a static pile, what are common mistakes people make with a static pile? And then how would you fix them? We basically just went over essentially the carbon and nitrogen ratio. What are maybe 2 other common mistakes that people make with a static pile, and how would you fix those?
A lot of times people just forget or don't bother.
I was hoping you were going to say that.
Yeah. And, I'm equally to blame. Or it's in a sunny location or rodents get in. So you want to keep it covered, but you also want to make sure it gets water. So I always like adding rainwater rather than chlorinated water, because that will immediately start killing off the microbes in there.
Okay, you beat me to my next question.
Right. So again, nothing cannot be fixed. There's always a solution. So you have a stinky pile now. What do? I would suggest take the whole thing apart, let it aerate, add a bunch of carbon, re-add it with more, add it back together, adding a lot more carbon as you're building up your lasagna.
And then the stink will go away.
Yeah. It will go, especially just grab a whole bunch of wood chips and that'll immediately absorb a lot of that high nitrogen.
All right. So then with vermicomposting, worm composting, which people are probably not as familiar with, kind of what are the mistakes? And you already talked about if they don't eat it, take it out. And then you totally threw interesting fact in there, throw it in the freezer. So what are 3 things to look out for with worm composting, and how do you fix those?
Right. So we used to do a lot of food waste, and we found it wasn't decomposing fast enough for the worms to eat it. So what we did for a while was we would dig up a hole, fill it with, we used to get food waste from a vegetarian restaurant. So we dump it in there, put a flag, dig it up 3 weeks later when it's half decomposed, and add that. That got old.
Yeah.
And then we put it in a food processor and process it. Also got old.
That's a lot of work.
And no. So what was the solution we came up with? We became friends with an organic juicer bar. And for the last 10 years, they've been saving their juicer scrap. Only the vegetables. So no fruits, nothing with seeds. They used to do tomatoes. Then we'd have tomato seeds germinating everywhere. And we trained them to only save us the vegetables. They get finished worm casting in exchange.
Okay.
And it's a wonderful relationship in terms of them getting rid of their food waste. And what a wonderful thing. Organic juice waste.
Yeah.
So full of nutrients, vegetative inputs only. And that seemed to be a perfect solution for us in terms of food that's half decomposed. The freezer method, though, is really effective. Just because it's so easy. You get a Ziploc bag, use it over and over again, throw everything in there, freeze it overnight, and now it'll break down so fast.
And that's just because as the water in the vegetables expands, it blows open the cell walls, and now you basically have an easier to digest. It's not as fibrous, it's not as tough, so it's easier to digest for the worms, right?
Exactly. That's why you do it.
Okay, so I'll ask that question. Okay, so you mentioned putting food in a food processor. That sounds, like you said, that got tiring. Like that's a whole extra step. Now I'm saving my scraps, then I'm putting my scraps through the food processor. What if, like, while I'm making dinner, I just kind of chop up the scraps that I have? You know, say it's the tops of a carrot or the parts of the leek that I'm not using, or what if I just make that smaller and then throw that in? Will that work in a similar method? And that way I don't have to have a freezer full of, vegetables. Personally, I always have a freezer full of frozen vegetables, but that's because I'm constantly making stocks and broths. So it's a totally different reason, but those of us who may not have room in our freezer or want to store all our veggie scraps, would chopping it up have a similar effect to running it through the food processor?
Yeah,
okay.
You're getting smaller pieces. The smaller the pieces, the faster they decompose.
Okay, so one of the big takeaways that I kind of got from what you were saying, and this is what I like, because it's not an exact science, and it's very similar to, because I just talked about cooking, it's very similar to cooking, where you can adjust the seasoning along the way. Like, it's not ruined. Like, if I have a little too much of this, then I can add a little more of this. I can always add salt little by little or whatever it might be, just to adjust the seasoning to get it just right. It's not like if I don't hit it the first time, it's over, which I think can be applied to pretty much all gardening. It's not an exact science necessarily. It is trial and error, and you need to give yourself grace to experiment and possibly fail. But the experimentation, the journey, is part of the fun of all this. So I think perfecting your recipe, to me, that would be fun. Perfecting your recipe would be fun. So let's just talk just about ready-made products, because it's spring now. So gardeners are going out and they're getting ready to start their garden. And there are facilities that have bulk compost, and then they have bagged compost. And let's just say the bagged products. Is there something to look for in a bagged compost product? Is there some way to know that one is better than another? Say they're both $17.99. Okay, but which one's better for me? Because that's what I want.
I would try to find someone who is composting in your neighborhood and build up a relationship with them and ask to see their soil test, so you know exactly what you're putting in your garden. I think that would be worth the effort.
Okay.
Rather than just buying a bag. Compost, what are the ingredients of the compost? We want it as simple and as clean as possible. Often when I'm looking at labels, I don't want to see anything except the one thing I'm buying. So chestnuts, that's the ingredient. So the more pure you can get your compost, but how are they making that compost? Are they using manures? Are they using grass and all these products that you don't know what animals have been fed, where these products came from? Are there other potential hazards in that compost? So that's why knowing where your compost comes from is the key. Or a reputable company that you're using. Coast of Maine comes to mind. I totally trust them. And so looking up online, what do other people say about this particular supplier? Because
the bag will tell you anything. I talk about that on here all the time, and anytime. The bag's going to promise you the world, but it's really, what is it? So I guess if you can't find the information on the bag, or before you go to the garden center, maybe look up, a few, like you said, Coast of Maine, and see if you can find any information on what they're using in their compost, or if they have anything on the site, on the facility. The other would be bulk, but here's the next question, and I'm not sure if you have this. I'm sure you do down where you are, but up by us, we have a number of food scrap composting companies that will come by. Like, you just put your food scraps out in a tin, they come by, pick it up, on the other end, at the beginning of the season or the other end of the season, you get X amount of cubic feet of compost. What do you think about, because this is an emerging business, like it started as like one or two, and now I'm seeing more and more of these businesses pop up. I guess you're going to probably say, are they a reputable business and what are they doing and how are they doing it? But like, is that a really good answer to our food waste problem and our compost problem?
Yeah, if we can support these people doing that work, that's the best thing we can do. If we are not composting ourselves, really, and there's some great people doing this work that I know of, that I'm friends with, and they're doing it because of the fact we're throwing out 40% of the garbage being food waste. It's insane. Yeah. And where I'm living, we're burning it.
Yeah.
Burning food waste. Let's think about that as a model. So it's a wonderful solution. Again, you might ask them, show us how you're doing it. Can we come and visit? Where are these food scraps? How are they mixed? And I think you will find from the research I've done, every company that I've looked at is totally reputable, doing it exactly right, and giving you amazing compost at the end. So bravo. I'm so glad that this is happening.
Yeah, I am as well, because like food waste is a huge problem. So I think this is a wonderful solution to a societal problem that we have. I think if you were going to open a composting business, most likely you're a soil nerd like the two of us, and you are going to want to be coming up with this awesome product. I also think it's a great solution for urban dwellers, because composting is really hard. I've done most of my work in the city. Composting is really hard because it does not take much to provide either food and or nesting habitat for unwanted guests such as rats, etc. I mean, when you live out in the suburbs or whatever, a raccoon might get in and make a mess of everything. That's different than having a nest of rats in the base of your compost pile. So I think it's a wonderful way to get the compost, because urban gardeners want compost too. So I think I'm just a really big fan of this method, and I'm certainly glad you are too. Which kind of then did answer our question, the bulk, and you answered it a little earlier. Buy from a reputable supplier. Is the compost certified organic? Find out how they do it, and make sure they're a reputable supplier. I got burned and did not do my research, and I was in the middle of a project and needed some compost last minute, I say, and just Googled who's got compost. I ran to this bulk yard, got it, and I was doing a meadow project, and my entire meadow within a couple weeks was just all weeds. It was just all weed seeds. I had to tear it all out and start again. This is where you have to do your research. It was the one and only time I did not research where I was getting my compost from. So you definitely want to check out that reputable buyer, for sure.
Side note there, the soil as well. If you get specialized soil, I've looked at that under the microscope. A lot of the fillers that they use is plastic. If it's moisture control, it means it's got plastic that holds the moisture. I've looked at desert mixed soil for if you want to grow cactuses and things like that. It's full of plastic, bits of plastic. You do not want to introduce that to your garden, period. So just be aware that this soil amendment can have other things in it that we really don't want.
Wow. All right. So
scary.
Some of these benefits that they're talking about on the bag is actually essentially a way to just get rid of waste that we don't want. We're dealing with our plastic problem by adding it to our soil mixes and our compost mixes and labeling it water retentive.
Stuff like that.
Wow.
And slow release, that's fertilizer.
Okay. See, this is just, so learning your compost labels, is very similar to learning your food labels. Like there are certain, key buzzwords, tricky things that, natural doesn't necessarily mean natural. It's a loophole that we can go through. We won't get into that, today, but it's good to read it. No matter what you're doing, it's certainly good to read the label. So we talked about how to make our compost. We talked about how to source our compost. Now we have our compost. How do I put it down? When do I put it down? Where do I put it down? Do I just throw it willy-nilly everywhere? Is a 1/4 inch good enough? What is the best way to apply compost to the landscape, and when is the best time to do it?
First thing I would do is a soil test, and make sure you include in that soil test what is your organic matter percentage. And once you know that, you'll know how much compost to put down. So you can put compost down if you have 5% or less organic matter. Over that, you really don't need it. And I generally would recommend not disturbing the soil as much as possible ever. Always leave the soil if you can. Even when you're pulling out weeds, cut them. Last year's crop, have them cut and let the leftover roots slowly decompose and food for the microbes. Now we're in spring. This is a perfect time to put a layer. It could be 1 inch, it could be 4 inches of compost on the surface and plant into that. Don't turn it in. You're disturbing all of that wonderful community of microbes that are in there. Disturbed soil will become, I'm now getting into another subject, bacterial dominant.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be selecting for weeds. So you're also turning up any weed seeds, and they're going to be in a perfect environment to germinate. Add the compost on top and plant into that. If you have half-finished compost, you would have wanted to put it down in the fall.
Okay. So if I'm home composting and my compost isn't quite there yet, but I need to start my bin again, I could take that half-finished compost, which has still got some chunks in it, put that down in the fall and just let winter kind of run its course with it. If I have finished compost, say I get it from one of these composting companies, say I buy it bulk from a reputable supplier, I could then just put down some of that over my bed. Now, here's the whole thing, Monique. I love compost. So what if I get my soil test? I love compost. I have a 6% organic matter. Does that mean I just have to break up with compost? What happens there? It's like, I think I'm doing this great thing. I'm saving all my food scraps. I'm making all this compost. I think I'm awesome. I get my soil test. It says I'm at a 6. Now what?
Well, it seems to be more and more of a problem as more and more of us are going towards compost. Who's ever heard of having too much organic matter in your soil? The thing is, what you want to avoid are extreme levels of nutrients, especially things like phosphorus. And a lot of soil tests that I look at, did I mention this is another good reason to do a soil test? The phosphorus is off the charts.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? There's no way to hold on to that phosphorus.
Right.
Nobody needs it. So it gets leached into our groundwater. And that's why we get algae blooms and all these other problems. Start with the soil test. Know what you have. If you find you can handle the more nutrients in that garden, then do it. If you find you're maxed out, just grow in it. And the plants that are in there will use up the nutrients that are there.
But then I should just give my compost away?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or you can still let it sit.
It's one of the things that this is one of the things that I love about vegetable gardening is vegetable gardening always comes back to community, because you will either have too much compost, here's my compost, too many eggs, here's some eggs, I have too much zucchini, here's some zucchini. It just fosters community and generosity for sure. This next question is something that I dealt with last year. I would love your professional advice on this because it is a problem in the landscape. What do I do about jumping worms? And there was actually 2 people on Tuesdays with Trev that brought up, I have a compost pile full of jumping worms. Do I just dump it into the woods? I said, don't you dare. Certainly not. But what does one do if because jumping worms are an issue, separate issue, but it's something that we're dealing with in the landscape. And jumping worms love organic matter, and our compost pile is great organic. So what do we do when our compost pile becomes infected?
And you'll know it's a jumping worm because it'll be, especially later in the season, it'll be gray and it will have a white band, which is the same diameter as the rest of the worm. This jumping worm is destroying the woods mainly by eating all of the duff, and then there's no soil structure left. They're too efficient in their job.
Mm-hmm.
What I ended up doing, because I had them here one year, this is now 3 years ago, I created an area where I added a lot of stuff. So just stuff that was starting to decompose. So my finished flowers I would put in there, and then weeds that I pulled up, and it was always loose. And it was a wonderful meeting ground for all the jumping worms.
Yes.
So I would pull that aside. They were always on the surface. I would take the worm, put them in a Ziploc bag in the sun, grow it out. I did this once every 3 days, once every week. And it slowly, all the worms kept filling this area because it was a perfect environment for jumping worms. 2 years of that. But I did notice the population going down. I haven't seen them.
Okay, but if my compost bin is full, do I just have to set the whole thing on fire? Do I move out? What happens?
If you do find you've got a compost full of jumping worms, you can spread it out, put a clear piece of plastic on it, and then solarize it. And that's the only thing that will kill the jumping worms and their little cocoons. because those cocoons are going to overwinter.
Yes.
The jumping worms themselves that are living now will not, but those cocoons will. So that's a very effective way if you know it's controlled in one area. And the reason they're in the compost is there's so much decomposing going on.
Right.
So that's what I would recommend.
Do I need to put it on my driveway so they don't just go into the soil?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, do it on the driveway.
It does. I have yet to find a jumping worm method that isn't relatively brutal and rather horrific, but it seems to be the way that we have to handle this issue. But I mean, it's one thing to look out for and be wary of as you are creating your compost pile, and you have to monitor your compost pile, because if it becomes a jumping worm breeding ground, that's going to ruin your garden in itself, especially if you spread that compost in your garden. Like, you are going to then ruin your garden with your compost. So it's another way that we need to watch out for. So another thing we have to watch out for.
If you do find jumping worms, do not share your soil with anyone. Don't say, oh, and here's a plant from my garden. No. And be careful, anything coming into your garden, that you make sure you know where it's from.
Yes. I've talked to a lot of garden clubs and say, when they do their plant swap, they're like, well, we've stopped doing our plant swap because of jumping worms. I'm like, bare root everything. Just take your plants, take your iris, wash all the soil off of it, and then go ahead and do your plant. But don't bring pot to pot to pot, and don't have all your soil, because all it takes is one person, and you're not going to know who it is. And now you have a whole group of people who love gardening, and you've totally just sabotaged yourself. So as we're coming to an end, I mean, this has just been an amazing discussion. I feel like anybody who's been listening has a much better idea that composting is an action item. It's a verb. It's an action word. It's really, while you have a static compost, there is still a lot going on there. So for anybody who's inspired, or anybody who is ready to get going and ready to figure this out, like, what is something? Where do I start? Or if I've already started, what is one thing that I can do?
Yes, perfect your composting.
Okay.
I'm still working on that. I'm always experimenting with new inputs, always tweaking where I am in the process, looking at other inputs that might work. For example, you could say you did a thermophilic pile. Well, no microbial life is left except for the bacteria that caused all that heat. Mm-hmm. You could inoculate that finished compost with compost tea, which is full of microbes, and speed up the process of bringing life back to thermophilic compost after it's gone through the thermophilic stage. What you can do is add something like indigenous trace minerals. So azomite is one. What I do is I'll go to the Bionutrient Food Association and get buckets to feed the worms, get buckets of basalt rock dust. And basalt rock dust is the indigenous rock dust of where I live. And putting that in my compost, it'll go through the gut of the worm, or it'll get decomposed, and then it will be plant available in the finished compost, so that your trace minerals will be in that finished compost. So I like things like that, where you are taking the best of everything and combining it. So I used to use a lot of paper and cardboard, and I don't do that anymore because it's not adding anything. Then I would rather add a little indigenous soil or weeds that have decomposed that have more fibers, more benefits to my compost. What we used to do is put towels down on our worm bin. If the bin was too wet, we'd put a dry towel to absorb some moisture. Mm-hmm. If it was too dry, we would put a wet towel until the worms ate the towel.
Okay.
So that kind of makes sense. In fact, one garden club that I know of gives all their garden members a pair of men's underwear, cotton underwear, and asks them to dig it in their gardens and put a flag and dig up the underwear a month later and compare and see how many microbes you actually do have in your soil. Because if you have underwear that's perfectly intact, just a little dirty, you're probably not a lot of life.
Your soil is dead.
Yeah. So that's an interesting, fun thing to try.
Wow. That sounds like a fun thing to do with kids. All right, we're going to bury dad's underwear, or bury your underwear, and let's dig it up and see how healthy it is. That sounds like an awesome activity.
You want to use cotton, though, nothing with like fleece.
Yes. No, it has to be 100%, natural. We can't have polyester or anything in it. That's just going to mess it up. So yes, duly noted, cotton underwear, put it in, but still, I can't think of a more fun activity to do with kids than planting underwear. So, Monique, this has been absolutely awesome. Gosh, I have so many more questions. Definitely going to need to have you back because there's so much more of the soil food web to discuss. This is just, no pun intended, but we're just scratching the surface of all of this. But if you have sparked a bunch of people's, attention, if they are very curious, where can we find you? Where can we find this information that you're talking about? How can we connect? What are some good sources? First, where do we find you? And where do we go to get more information? Now, here I am. I've listened to the podcast. I'm all hyped up. I'm ready to go. I still have some follow-up questions. Where do I get those answers?
You can always email me. It's m16bosch, BOSCH, @gmail.com. So that's just my home email address, or Monique@ctnofa.org, or info@wiggleroom.org. So on our Wiggle Room website, we do have a information section on starting your own worm bin.
Okay.
We also have microbes there if you want to see what is living in soil and compost. So that is something, because I would encourage everyone to just start your own worm bin. It's really easy. You just get a small Vermihut little stackable worm bin, and it's fun, especially if you have kids. And getting the worms to do the work for you is really
Monique,
wonderful.
you realize it's a terrible business model. Start your own. Do it yourself.
We're not doing it to be in business. We're doing it to change, to move the needle.
And that's what's awesome. And that's absolutely what I love about you. Monique, thank you so much for all of this information. This has been, this has just been great. It's been great seeing you. It's been a while. So it's so good to see you. So good to nerd out with you, on soil and compost, once again. I very much appreciate you going on. We will put the links that you mentioned, in the show notes, and hopefully people will reach out and hopefully people will be inspired, but to learn how to compost responsibly. Balance is key to everything.
Daisy and I, she obviously had to be part of the show.
Yes.
Still a puppy and is looking for a walk. So we're
okay. Well, you go ahead and walk Daisy. This has been awesome, Monique. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye, Trevor.